Jessica, you can start recording as well.
Okay.
Jessica, you can start recording as well. Sorry, that was my YouTube. We'll all keep ourselves on mute other than whoever is speaking.
One thing I didn't ask you, Pallavi, would you like our videos off when we aren't presenting, just to help with,
Yes, that's how, and I can regulate that on my side, so only the speakers are going to be visible.
Sounds good.
Hello and welcome to Mindful Conversations. And today our webinar is titled The Continual Creation of Culture, featuring Debasri Basu from India and Michael Windover from Canada. And we are really looking forward to your presentations, Debasri and Michael, and welcome to the webinar. And thank you very much for your participation. I also want to welcome the organizing team here, Caitlin Van Deven, Jessica Wiedmark, Madeline Quinn, Tia Reid, Anastasia Rosillo, Brittany Cox. And my name is Pallavi Swaranjali, and I'll be moderating the session today. So the whole webinar will consist of our presenters. They will be presenting 20 minutes in back-to-back, and then we will have a conversation between the two speakers. The question and answer session will follow. And if you are watching us on YouTube, feel free to put in your questions there in the chat window, and we can bring it in here into the webinar. And if you are here with us in the webinar, please put in your questions in the chat tab at the bottom, and we will take it as we go forth. So let's welcome our first speaker, who's Debasri, and I would invite Caitlin to introduce Debasri.
So Dr. Debasri Basu is an assistant professor employed with West Bengal Education Service, currently serving the Department of English, undergraduate and postgraduate at Maulana Azad College in Kolkata, India. She completed her doctoral studies on Partition literature of the Indian subcontinent at the Department of English, University of Calcutta. Her other research interests range from British literature of the 18th century to Indian writings in English, Bengali, and Hindi, as well as resistance literature and popular culture. So everyone, please help me welcome Debasri.
Thank you, Caitlin, for that elaborate introduction. And I would also like to thank Pallavi Swaranjali for inviting me to speak in this webinar. I also welcome my fellow speaker, Michael, the team organizers, as well as today's audience. I'll be speaking on material memory in Indian partition studies. So here, let me first share my screen with you all. It's going to be a very short presentation, just around 10 slides, but I do feel that I need to speak about each of them in some detail. So here it goes. As you can see, I've titled it Material Memory and Creation of Culture in Indian Partition Studies. Before actually beginning, let me just give you a brief overview of Indian partition for the non-cultural audience.
Debasri, would you like to make your screen a full screen at the bottom, if you see?
Yes, yes, yes. Just a moment. Oh no.
I think Debasri is experiencing some technical difficulties there. We'll give her 5 minutes and then see how that goes. Sorry about that. I think Debasri's internet is creating a little bit of problem. She will be joining soon. In the meantime, I will also remind all of our audience that all these webinars will be available for later viewing on our YouTube channel. So if you want, you can subscribe to the channel and all our webinars will be available there for you to watch later. And another webinar is coming soon on Saturday, which features two distinguished speakers, Roger Khanna and Vibhuti Sachdev, and they will be talking about the value and the implications of disruption in culture. And it'll be a very interesting session. So please join us on Saturday as well. While we wait for Debasri, Michael, would you be comfortable starting with your presentation just to be saving on time?
Sure. Yeah, I was going to suggest that I could just jump in. My intro slide though was going to talk a little bit about her stuff before changing gears, but that's okay.
That's okay.
A little bit of a preview, and hopefully it'll make sense.
Thank you.
So, yeah, that's no problem. So I don't know if, yeah.
Sure. Go ahead if you want to share your screen, and we'll wait for Debasri in the meantime.
Do you need to do an intro for me, or do you want me to just?
Yes, I will. I will ask Jessica to introduce you to our audience, and then Jessica, do you want to take over?
So if everybody can welcome Michael Windover, an associate professor of art and architectural history and assistant director of the School for Studies in Art and Culture at Carleton University. A historian of modern architecture, design, and material culture, his research interests include the intersections of architecture with other media and the effects and effective dimensions of everyday design. He is cross-appointed to the Institute of Comparative Studies in Literature, Art, and Culture, and to the School of Industrial Design at Carleton, as well as being adjunct curator of design at Ingenium, Canada's Museum of Science and Innovation. He is currently Vice President of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada and Commissioning editor of Dalhousie Architectural Press's series, Canadian Modern. Thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Jessica. Yeah, it's always nice to have such a lovely intro, and thank you to Pallavi and the rest of the organizing and the team and Devasri, and I really look forward to our conversation today. I've maybe presented a little too much here. Maybe you've prepared a little too much, and my students would say that's not unusual. But here we go. I'm going to give it a go, and I'll try to keep as concise as possible. You'll see that I've titled my my little presentation, "The Place of Domestic Objects in the Spaces of Memory." And what I'm planning to do is really look at how objects in domestic spaces in Canada in particular can evoke memories and change the quality of space for both individuals and communities. And I think these are ideas that we're going to see in Devastri's presentation as well. So my hope was to kind of draw some links there, but I'll leave it to her to do that if she's able to. Or she thinks that those links are there. The key ideas here. So objects have the potential to evoke memories and change, and they can, memories and can change the quality of space for individuals and community. And this is premised on the idea that objects or things are non-human components of society. Okay, so, and here I'm drawing from the work of Bruno Latour and others in actor network theory, but also in material culture studies, that suggests that objects have a kind of agency, that people and non-humans work together to make society. Now, they don't have the same agency as humans, and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by agency as we go through this, but this is kind of a key idea that's sort of underpinning this argument today. Objects, I would say, and based on their work, can suggest things, they can afford things, but they can also provoke and encourage certain memories. And I think this is tied to our theme today. They work together with humans in sort of semi-tangible heritage practices. So, and like Devasri, what I'm going to do is have a sort of tripart organization, and I'm going to draw from 3 different research projects that I've been involved in the last little while. The first one is something I'm working on with my colleague in music at Carleton University, James DeVille, and we've just recently been looking at the place of the piano in early 20th century living rooms and parlors. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to move on to talking about radio, which is a longer standing interest of mine. And the case study I'm going to focus on was recently published in John Potvin and Marie-Ève Marchand's book, Design and Agency at Bloomsbury. So a big a chunk of that will come from that recent piece of publication. And very special thanks to Silvio and Leo Straczynski for agreeing to interview, allowing me to interview them rather, and for donating the radio that I will be talking about. And then my third case study, if I have time, and I'm mindful of the time here, will come from a project called Designing Domestic Dining, which is a collaborative project involving Ingenium, Canada's Museums of Science and Innovation, Carleton University, and Algonquin College, as well as members of the Anatolian community in Ottawa. And I'll talk more about that when I get there, but I see I should really get going here. So again, the idea is that in each case, what I'm going to do is draw on the thread of object agency and its entanglement with memory and diaspora in what we're calling in this session, the continual creation of culture. So to start, I want to consider the place of the piano in early North American parlors or living rooms. And despite the size of these things, they have oddly been overlooked in literature on interiors. But pianos have a a real character. They change the character of the room. They have a sort of presence in the room, and they can change the feel of the room depending on who's playing the piano, what time of day it is, if there's a special event going on, that sort of thing. They also, just by their nature, suggest certain ideas around maybe prestige, perhaps memories as well of your past listening to the piano and that sort of thing. So with my colleague, James DeVille, we've started looking at things like interior decoration and advice literature, like the Modern Priscilla Home Furnishing book. And you can see an image there where you see a piano positioned in a room. And the idea is how do you make a nice ensemble of furniture to fit, that fits both a piano and other features. And you can see here they're drawing on that 18th century style of showing both the floor plan as well as sort of the elevations all in one view. So what we've been looking at is how pianos can orchestrate and change the atmosphere of a room. And we've been looking at a broad variety of different kinds of sources, whether it's middle-brow literature, advice and etiquette literature, and even home catalogs. And so the other image I have here is from the Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog, where you could literally buy a sort of prefab house from Sears, which was also a big department store, and you could fill it with other objects from Sears as well. And in almost all of the plans for these, you see a reference to the piano, and you can see the date here, 1925. And so it just goes to show that the piano was a real foundation in domestic spaces. It's sort of an anchor and a focal point in middle-class norms in North America. And if we zoom in a little bit here, even in this fairly small, so on the left, you've got a fairly affluent space there with a big grand piano. And on the right, you can see the place of the piano in a fairly small living room and its importance there. And the design of the house itself, you can see just above that piano, a small window there. And you can see that in the drawing above, is sometimes referred to as a piano window. So houses were in some ways designed around the piano. That's how significant they were to everyday life. So again, it reminds us of the popularity and importance of pianos in North American homes, if only aspirational for some. And in some ways, it was almost like a unit of measurement. You could say this room is big enough that it can fit a piano, and everybody sort of knew what that meant. This points to the significance of living rooms or parlors as site of domestic musical performance and entertainment. So, and for our purposes today, we can think about how members of communities could come together and sing songs or listen to music that responds to their traditions. And so they can bring, and if it's a diasporic community, a little piece of home in the form of music. And it's in the activation of the piano that they really are able to have that kind of heritage practice. Here's a roughly contemporary piece of design advice literature by Emily Burbank. And here she notes the importance of piano to producing atmosphere. She describes this room for the amusement of young people in a small house in these terms, and I'll quote: "In thinking of this room, one recalls an impression of space, a hardwood floor with rugs small enough to be easily taken up for dancing, an open fire, a piano with songs on the rack, bright lights, plenty of them with dainty pink shades, comfy chairs, and one big sofa before the fire. Here, young people could dance, sing, play bridge, or gather around the fire for storytelling, while someone toasted marshmallows. It was a young people's room to remember." And again, I just want to point to the importance of the piano in anchoring this arrangement of furniture, but also the activities there. So piano joins the players and listeners in social activities. Without it, we wouldn't have those social activities in the same way. And what I want to do now is draw on the theory of the sociologist and historian of science, Andrew Pickering, who talks about a kind of dance of human and non-human agency. he emphasizes performance, the sort of blurring of boundary between the two as a sort of social event unfolds. In this case, it would be like music. So the musician plays the piano, and once the piano starts, there's sort of a blurring of the line between human and non-human in the creation of a sort of of an event that then reminds us of things from the past, but also is a sort of heritage practice, bringing those ideas of the past into the present. And the example of a player piano is also brings this out as well. And we can think of almost this sort of spectral presence of a recorded player at a piano, and you can see this ad here, bringing that music and bringing those ideas into the home. And one of the reasons why I brought this one in is not only to remind us of the place of player pianos in this period, which was important, but also this ad set describes us as a very good friend to this family. So there's an almost anthropomorphic idea associated with this piano. So again, all of this is to say that that music is based on repetition, on memory, but also on innovation and change. And this makes it an important cultural or heritage practice. It keeps memories of the past replaying in the present. And we'll see this in my subsequent examples as well. So my next example is the radio. And as I said before, I've been working on radios and their impact on space for a little while. Initially, it joined the piano and the player piano, but eventually sort of supplanted it in some middle class homes as a sort of site of entertainment and edification. And like the piano, it had the power to change the character of space. Instead of just bringing the past in through traditional songs or recorded piano rolls, it could instantly bring other spaces together. And to illustrate that point, I'm looking at another advertisement, this time for Northern Electric Radio's Coronation series. And this line of radios was designed specifically to line up with the coronation of King George and Queen Elizabeth in 1937. And what we see here is you've got father with his pipe and mother and daughter and son all gathered around the radio, sitting on a table, looking at a newspaper, pointing, and they're following the events in London from their home, presumably somewhere in Canada. And this idea reminds us that the radio has the power to bring activities in other parts of the world into the homes of the listener. And it's in the activity of listening through and with material objects that we have the creation of what we could call a sort of radio public. Also, just a quick note too, is you can see here how the monarchy is being modernized through modern technology like the radio. So even age-old institutions are allowed a kind of a rebirth or continuation of its sort of life and heritage through these modern means. So it's new and old at the same time in a kind of way. So radio receivers in domestic space, they connect people from other spaces, and that also includes wires and broadcasters and all the rest of this together into what I'm calling a sort of radio public. And this cover of an Eaton's company catalog reminds us of that. So you've got the sort of spectral orchestra below, sending music up in the air, and then you've got these people from the far north, presumably with this Mountie listening to a radio, and this worker listening intently, and everybody's listening together, and they're all smiling and happy, of course, because they bought their radios from Eaton's, but they come together in that sort of unit. And the image on the right from 1945 shows an image of Canada, and I don't know how well you can see that, but those little sort of white blobs on the map of Canada going across there are actually indicating where the large high power transmission stations for the CBC were located. And this allowed for the creation of a sort of national radio public. But, and then this of course is really potent and force in the 1930s, both in Canada, the United States, and elsewhere, as we'll see. I should also note that while it has the potential to be national in scope, and this is very powerful, especially for a country the size of Canada, it also works on much smaller set of scales. So we think of the local radio in town and how it gives you the weather or the traffic forecast today, but it can also allow for the distinct local and regional cultures to sort of coalesce through the creation of radio publics as well. So it can be used to help foster a sense of common heritage and the promotion of particular stories, and therefore has a very sort of potent political force as well as a social force. And as we know, it was used to great effect in the 1930s by Adolf Hitler, his propaganda minister, Goebbels, and the Nazi Party. And part of what they did is they made radio present through loudspeakers in public spaces, but also through a state-sponsored program of production of cheap radios like the VE 301 or the Volksempfänger, the sort of people's radio, which was released in 1933. And 301 actually refers to January 1933 when Hitler ascended to power. So this is very much connected to the myth and the cult of the Führer. And the reason for this, making these cheaper radios, was to get his word or the party's word out to the majority of people. And this was a very popular program. They sold for about 2 weeks' pay or so at the time, the average pay. And so between 1934 and 35, 44% of all radios sold in Germany were of this kind of model. So it was a very successful program in getting these things out. And the image on the right there shows a distribution of 500 of these kinds of receivers in 1938. They were low power, they had poor sensitivity, and in a way, they were sort of designed to be used locally. They were not designed to listen beyond Germany or too far beyond Germany. The idea was they were designed to listen to the state propaganda. And in a way, what we see here is social design, right? We've got the commodity design of the radio, we've got the design of the broadcast, but we also have a larger sort of social design, the idea of a kind of German nationalist state. And you see how radio as a material component joins ideology in that sort of configuration. We can compare this to a roughly contemporary model, the Aachen Super D52 from 1937. And it was produced by Philips, one of the companies that also produced these Volksempfängers, along with about 26 other manufacturers. Now, this one is quite different. I mean, on the surface, they're both fairly modern in their look. The Aachen Super doesn't have an image of an eagle on it. But other than that, they're both fairly modern in their design. But it's much more powerful. It's a 7-tube radio. It has the ability to broadcast both long and short wave. It also has a very sophisticated dial on the front there. This is what they call the mono knob, was sort of an innovation where when you turn the top, you can adjust the station, you adjust the volume by moving up or down, and adjust the tone by moving right and left. It's almost like those old iPods, when you could do a whole lot of things with just your thumb. And it could also be sort of attached to a larger entertainment system. So you could add a turntable to it or another loudspeaker. And so it was a fairly high-end unit and fairly sophisticated. It's quite different from this Volksempfänger in terms of its potential and the potential for the user to be insinuated within a kind of or constituted within a radio public. And you see this in particular when we look at the dial, right? So the dial here, unlike the VE 301 here, which just had numbers, here you've got place names marked across the top. And in a way, this is a sort of map of the world, right? It's a different configuration of the world, a sort of mapping. And you can imagine how the user becomes like a cosmopolitan. By turning the dial, they can travel the world. And as they look into the little sort of circular window on the left, it would glow green as they approached a clear channel. So there's almost a sort of synesthetic experience where there are audio, sort of sonic cues, as well as the tactile nature of turning the dial, and of course the visual of the green. And so it prompts listeners to conceptualize space in a very sort of particular way, allowing them to sort of travel virtually. Now, this comes out in 1937. By 1939, there was a law in Germany forbidding listening to foreign stations. That was seen as a treacherous act. So you can see how the potential here was circumvented in some ways by the law as we were sort of moving towards the Second World War. And there's a lot more we can talk about, but I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to move on here to talk about this particular model. Okay, so this is actually a radio that was owned by the Weinbergs, and then later their child Sylvia Straczynski, and then it later came into the Carleton collection. So this was donated to Carleton by Sylvia and Leo Straczynski in 2017. And its story begins in 1948 at the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp, when it was acquired by Judah Weinberg. And it traveled, he had traveled there a few years earlier to be reunited with his wife, Sarah. And their daughter, Sylvia, was born there. Now, the Weinbergs were originally from Poland, but that's where they were after sort of the trauma of the institutionalized murder of Jews in Germany and across Europe through the 1930s and into 40s. Now, according to the oral history, Judah made his money in the displaced persons camp at Bergen-Belsen, selling smoked fish, and he was hiding this under his coat, and he was traveling by motorbike and that sort of thing. So he made some money in that way, and then he likely bought this radio at a flea market nearby. And we need to bear in mind, too, that prior to the war, Jews in Germany were outlawed from even owning radios. So obviously things have, in terms of the legal thing, things have kind of changed here. They took this radio when they immigrated to Canada in May 1948, and they packed it in a trunk with 2 duvets and 2 pillows. In addition, they had 1 small suitcase with diapers and clothing for baby Sylvia and 1 other for the parents. So that just goes to show how important this object was to them. They probably could have sold it to help avoid going into debt to make their travel, but they kept it with them. And that's really significant to the story. They arrived in Halifax, and then they continued on to Montreal. And for 2 years, they lived in a triplex in West Plateau, Montreal neighborhood. They moved to a duplex nearby and stayed there until 1961, at which point they moved to an apartment which they purchased up in Park Extension, which is a little bit further north in Montreal, with the money that they received as restitution from Germany. Now, in all of these places, the radio sat in the living room or parlor, and it played a role in everyday life routines. They listened to news coverage frequently. They also listened to variety shows for entertainment. And on Sunday, they tuned into the Jewish hour at 10 a.m. Judah would also enjoy listening to shortwave broadcasts at night. And he thought this was a really great quality about this. And it also reminds us, too, of how a radio like this can operate differently, especially for diasporic communities who aren't just traveling the world out of interest. They might be trying to connect with a notion of home beyond. Generally, this radio was used for purposeful listening rather than just sort of background music or background noise. Now, even after they acquired a television in the 1960s, this radio was their trusted conduit for news. They trusted the radio over the newer medium of television. And Judah and Sarah maintained this, replacing worn out tubes well into the 1970s. And in the late 70s, he passed away. In 1981, Sarah died, and this then came to Sylvia and her husband, Leo. and then later came to Carleton. So it was used in connection with communities, especially locally, okay? But we can also think of its ability to transcend geography for a diaspora, as I noted. It allowed them to escape in entertainment and remain vigilant. And they were quite concerned to listen for any anti-Semitic comment or feel in the air to be ready to move at any point. And obviously this was due to the fact that they were traumatized by the Holocaust and war, and this affected the way that they experienced the radio. Now, while radio and other electronic media are associated with instantaneity or contemporaneity, we could argue that this particular radio also had a kind of mimetic quality. It reminded them of past events, and it would continue to do this for Sylvia and Leo when it became a kind of historical object and stopped being used to listen, to tune in. And in some ways, it's like this today at Carleton. So its value has shifted, but its ability to still solicit our responses remains. So rather than creating sound as it did before, now it solicits questions about the memories, history, and design practices of the past. I'm going to turn now to Pallavi. Do I have enough time, Pallavi, to go and finish my last case study, or would you like me to wrap up now?
No, Michael, I think you're good with time.
Okay, just making.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so I have one more case study, and I hope you're seeing some lines being drawn between all of these things as I sort of rush through all the things that I was hoping to talk to you about. And the last example is connected to designing domestic dining, which, as I mentioned at the outset, is a collaborative project involving researchers and curators from Ingenium, at Carleton University, and Algonquin College. And the point of it was sort of spurred on by a desire from the museum to better represent and meaningfully engage with members of diasporic communities. And so what we decided to do was connect with members of the Anatolian community. And this was in large part based on the expertise and affiliation of our lead interviewer, Helen Burke, who you see sort of on the far left there. This is you've got some images here of our full team. So you've got Helen Burke, David Dean, Simran Sethi, and Izzy Redgate on the left underneath the Carleton banner. Under Algonquin College, you've got Professor Dorothy Stern, and then Charlie Ford, James Napton, and Jade Scatliff, who are interior design students. And then on the right, Ingenium's curators, Rebecca Dolgoy and Emily Gann. And the hope here was to explore the intersections of food, memory, domestic technology, and interior space. So we drew from a variety of different expertise and interests in sort of the constitution of this team. Now, with the onset of COVID, our original plan to hold a sort of an event with members of the Anatolian community, was truncated, was stopped, I guess. And instead, what we decided to do was to pivot. That's the term of, I guess, of the last year or so. And instead, do a series of interviews over Zoom. And what we did with them was we interviewed these members of the community, and we asked them to make a dish that they thought was of some significance. And as they prepared it and cooked it, they discussed its significance. They talked about why it was important to them. And the team members, which included, as I've noted, interior design students from Algonquin, they made sketches as a way of recording and interpreting as the interviews happened. And we asked questions about how the food was prepared, the role of domestic technology there. And we also were able to think about and record how food making practices and activities affected the design of domestic interiors. And some historians have looked at food spaces as being central to the development of domestic architecture. And so we're looking at that and thinking about those elements. Now, the example that I wanted to bring to you is from one of our interviewees, Aydin Kanatar. He's a chef at a popular local restaurant, Farou's Cafe, if you're in Ottawa, and is originally from Mersin in Turkey. Now, food as a chef, I mean, food is at the center of his life. And I think, as I said before, I mean, it's maybe in some ways at the center of all of our lives. A lot of our routines are based around when we eat and that sort of thing, and how we share food with others in our space. Now, in our interview, we learned that he approaches the design of his space almost along the same lines that he designs his food. So the space, like his ingredients, are systematically and functionally organized. But his bachelor apartment is full of pops of color and of course, and also artisan works. And he appreciates those artisan works for their imperfections, for their sort of human touch. And we can almost see how that plays out in his cooking. So during the interview, he prepared a lamb kebab, and we watched him rock the knife, and you can see a drawing by James there, back and forth as he talked about how he learned to use a knife, and how he was encouraged to go to culinary school and hone those skills. And demonstrated along the way embodied heritage practices. So not only is it the design of the knife, but also the knowledge and use of the knife and the repetition over time that makes it a kind of heritage practice. That idea, that practice shows us how, again, the past and the immediate present come together in that moment, and that's sort of what I'm calling a sort of heritage activity, much as we could see with somebody playing at a piano or even maybe turning on a radio. Now, while the knife traveled from Turkey to Canada, in some ways it might remind us of the Straczynski's Weinberg's radio. I wanted to point to one other example here, and that is just his ordinary apartment's electric oven. And here we're talking about something that's located in place, but he changes it, he innovates in order to make this meal that has a connection to him, a connection to home. And so what he does is, as he explains to us, he went to the dollar store and bought some stones, he put it in a tray with some water, and in a way kind of created like a mini sauna within the oven. And that allowed a kind of more even heat distribution and a higher temperature, which allowed him to make something that was maybe more authentic or closer to the food practices from home. And so here we can see how objects, yes, they can be brought and they can carry that kind of connection, but heritage activities can also be involved with things sort of on the ground, a sort of making do or bricolage, in order to allow for a connection to memory and experiences of the past. And so so we see how engaging with material objects and knowledge and memory guide this sort of heritage activity. So I guess in sum, today's presentation has given me the opportunity to think about ideas of memory, diaspora, and cultural creation that wind through a few different projects. And I wasn't always necessarily thinking about those in those terms. And so I appreciate this opportunity to do that. Now, whether a parlor piano, a family radio, or a contemporary oven, designed objects, I would say, become crucial parts of individual or community memory through the enactment of heritage practices. These practices often engage a number of our senses, and I hope my brief consideration of a few ongoing projects shows what can be gained by thinking about the spatial and multisensorial effects of humans and non-humans in these activities. These examples remind us of the potency of everyday design and just how important objects like these are to the creation of culture and memory. And I think I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry if I've gone on a little too long, Pallavi and friends, but I appreciate your attention.
Michael, we enjoyed that thoroughly, so I didn't even notice the time. So that was a great presentation. Thank you so much for that. And I think we have Debasri here back with us. And I the ideas that she will bring in from the other side of the world, I think, will really accentuate some of the things that you were talking about, Michael. And I'm really intrigued by this idea of how objects of the everyday uh, transform and become almost magical in some ways when in the diasporic community, especially. And those are great projects. So thank you again for that. And welcome back, Debasri. We're eagerly looking forward to your presentation. So it's over to you now.
Well, first of all, I need to apologize for that technical glitch. The Wi-Fi connection here is rather patchy, so I got disconnected. But then it was just a couple of minutes, and I'm glad to be back. And I could listen to Michael's presentation, in fact, in its entirety. And as he has pointed out, even something as a commonplace as a kebab knife can evoke memories of one's home, which is now perhaps, beyond one's reach. And taking a cue from this, I would once again go back to my presentation. Let me share the screen. Is it visible?
Yes. Yes, Debasri, it is.
Okay.
And do you want to go to full screen mode now?
Just a minute.
Go to slideshow, and probably that's where.
Actually, I was trying for the F5 button, but for some reason it seems to be not quite functional.
If you press this button on the bottom here, Debasri, can you see my little red, and
Yes,
that'll
yes,
take you.
I can.
Yes.
Yes,
There.
finally. Okay, so as I was explaining, uh, today I'll be speaking on material memory and creation of culture in Indian partition studies. I have decided to focus mainly on three different categories. But before that, let me give you a brief overview of the history of the Indian partition, especially for the non-culture part of our audience today. Uh, as some of you might know, the Indian continent was partitioned into not two, but actually three parts, which is India and the two wings of Pakistan, West Pakistan and then East Pakistan, which is now currently the country Bangladesh. Now, this map gives a rough idea of the movement of migrants and refugees. As you can see, uh, non-Muslims from West Pakistan and East Pakistan moved to mainland India, whereas mainly Muslim migrants and refugees were known as Muhajirs. They left India and moved to the two wings of West and East Pakistan. As the next slide shows, this partition was accompanied by a massive migration of population. And in most cases, this was not out of volition, but very much under duress. As you can see in these two photographs, trainfuls of people, and in some cases when people even couldn't afford train tickets, they had to actually cross the border on barefoot, carrying with them the bare minimum, whatever they could, carry on their own person, since in most cases there was a very strict vigil, and anything of value, of monetary value, was actually snatched from these migrants as they crossed the border. So as we can all imagine, it was a pitiable condition for most of them, and they were turned penniless, paupers overnight because of this particular decision. Now, today, as I said, I'll be speaking of material memory and the creation of culture, focusing on three distinct categories. The first would be oral narratives, then literary texts, and finally, cinema. So coming to the first category of oral narratives, I would here like to present a work which I consider to be a seminal work in this direction, where ordinary household objects were in a way memorialized for the first time in Indian partition studies through a book. Now, this was actually the brainchild of the partition researcher Aanchal Malhotra, herself belonging to a family whose members had to come to India from Western Pakistan, from what is now Pakistan. And Aanchal conducts interviews. In fact, this is a continual process for her first book, which was published in 2017, and which I'll be referring to today. She had spoken to people, men and women, in various cities of India as well as Pakistan. She visited Pakistan and spoke to refugees and migrants, and got to see the objects, the articles that these people managed to bring along while fleeing from their lands. As I've already said, violence was the most potent driving force for these people leaving their native lands. I would like to mention the name of Aanchal's book here. When it was originally published in 2017, it had the title Remnants of a Separation, A History of the Partition Through Material Memory. And this book created a big splash. In 2018, Aanchal Malhotra had been to Kolkata during the Kolkata Literary Meet, and I was fortunate enough to attend a session at Victoria Memorial. That actually, sort of opened a totally new vista for me, because until then I was limiting myself only to partition literature, which is my primary discipline, me being a student of literature. But then Aanchal's book fascinated me, and I got to read the book. It was quite a success, so much so that a couple of years later, in 2019, the book was slightly revised. In fact, it was expanded, and it had its international release. This time it was published by Hearst Publishers in the United Kingdom, and the new title was Remnants of Partition, 21 Objects from a Continent Divided. Now, out of these 21 objects in today's webinar, I would like to focus on 8. And I have broadly classified them into ordinary household objects, like in this particular slide, as you can see. The first is a hammam dasta, which is actually the North Indian term for mortar and pestle, with which we crush spices and other such condiments for preparing food. And this belonged to the Mirchandani family, who were originally residents of Karachi in Sindh. After partition, when Pakistan became a new country, it was Karachi which became the capital. It was much later that the present capital city of Islamabad was founded. So until then, Karachi received the heaviest influx of migrants into Pakistan. And not surprisingly, Savitri Mirchandani's family had to migrate because it was no longer safe for most of the Sindhi Hindu families staying there. So while coming back to India, actually she had been to India earlier also for visiting her relatives, but this time it was a permanent separation. She sailed away from Karachi dock and reached Bombay, and she was accompanied by her 2 children, and she was allowed to carry just one suitcase. And uh, since cooking is an integral part of all of us almost, so this Hammam Dista found its way into her luggage. As I was saying, that most of the belongings that these migrants and refugees managed to bring along with them were such ordinary articles. I mean, very commonplace, but yet, after all these years, because they proved to be not just very useful in the days immediately after partition migration, but also the fact that they evoked such rich memories. These objects have assumed a very special place in the hearts and minds of these migrants. The adjacent picture shows a pair of scissors. It belongs to the Kohli family. Now, what could be more mundane than a pair of scissors? And in fact, when Professor Kohli, his full name is Professor Satpal Kohli, initially he used to wonder why his mother had brought along this pair of scissors. It was much later he understood that while staying back in Western Punjab, where they were originally from Lahore, his mother used to tailor make their own clothes using this pair of scissors. So now that they had migrated still, and I mean, this particular pair of scissors reminded the mother of her life back in Lahore. And it constituted a piece of a memento which retained its value for the mother, even if the monetary value was minimal. Now, moving on to the next slide. Here, once again, uh, it has a resonance to Michael's third object, which he touched upon in his presentation about the kebab knife. The two photos that you see in this particular slide relate to kitchenware utensils that were brought by the refugees while coming from their erstwhile homes into India. The first is actually a ghara. It was made of a German silver. Now, the ghara in English can be translated to a round-bottomed vessel, something like a pot, and the long metal stick that you see here, it's known in the Indian vernacular as a freni. This ghara and the freni was basically used for churning yogurt to make lassi, which is a popular drink in India. It's consumed during the summer months. It's a yogurt-based drink which keeps the body cool during the harsh and hard heat of the Indian summer. It belongs to the witch family, which is incidentally Achal Malhotra's maternal side of the family. So in a way, Achal Malhotra had interviewed her own paternal grandfather and relatives on her father's side as well as her mother's side while writing this particular book. And this particular ghara belonged to the witch family, her mother's family. In the adjacent photo, you see a simple plate and spoon. It's actually the plate and spoon, once again, which belong to Achal Malhotra's grandparents. Something as commonplace as the plate and the spoon, and yet it turned out to be a very important article for these migrants, freshly returned refugees who had come to India without anything to speak of. And without these utensils, they would have nothing to eat on. As you can see, this was a sort of common utensil found in those days. It was originally made of brass, but there was a silvering lining some of it is still visible over here. In the Indian vernacular, it's known as kolai. As in Bengali, which is my mother tongue, we usually call it as kolai korabashan. That means a utensil which has a silvering layer, lining on the brass or the copper, so that the heat doesn't destroy the main metal. Now, once again, as we see, something as commonplace as the eating plate and the spoon assumes great significance to these people, because for them at that point of time, in the months immediately after the partition, that was what sort of still maintained some semblance of normalcy for them. Otherwise, they would have to eat, say, on whatever they could lay their hands on. In most cases, it was just plates made of leaves for others who didn't even have such metal utensils. Now, after kitchenware and household items, let us move on to something more elaborate, like clothes. And a look at both these photos shows that these are not ordinary clothes, but slightly exquisite. The first photo is actually a large scarf. In the Punjabi language, it's known as a bag. I belong to the Chaudhary family, and I hope the fine threads and embroidery is visible. It's basically a kind of traditional Punjabi embroidery known as a fulkari, and the Chaudhary family had brought this particular bag in a way which would prevent it from being stolen on the train journey. Now, India was partitioned in August. August, as we, the subcontinental populace, know, is very hot and muggy out here. And yet, the mother, she actually had this chadar, it was rather thick, on her body during the train journey, so that it wasn't stolen. So, I mean, this actually gives us some idea of how insecure and fearful these men and women were while they were making this journey across the border. The adjacent picture is actually of a pashmina shawl. Now, pashmina shawl is expensive because of the material with which it is woven. It's actually the fine pashmina wool from Kashmir, and there is a Kashmiri stitch embroidery which can be seen on the edges. Now, incidentally, this particular shawl belongs to the Singh family, and it has an interesting background story. Originally, the shawl was very large, so much so that the mother to whom it belonged, she cut it into two and gave the two pieces of the shawl to her two daughters. Now, when Achal Malhotra was interviewing the Singh family, she noticed that one of the two edges of the shawl had been roughly sewn with a brown thread, and she noticed that this was actually the point where the original pashmina shawl had been cut. In a way, uh, the division of this shawl can be said to be mirrored in the larger division of the country. Once again, just like the rough edges of the shawl, the boundaries, the borders of the country were also rough, jagged, and as we know from our lessons in history, it created a lot of uneven surfaces I'm not talking not just of the topography, but also the political relations between the neighboring countries, even till this day, unfortunately, which has really kept the tempers frayed for many in both these nations. Now, the final slide belonging to the first section, that is pertaining to the oral narratives, actually deals with the jewelry. Now, this is exceptional because, as I've said, most migrants and refugees couldn't really bring much. So, the people who could actually bring these ornaments, these pieces of jewelry along with them while crossing the border were actually the lucky few. The first photo shows a string of pearls which belonged to Azra Haq. The pearls had been gifted to her by Ganga Singh, the Maharaja of Bikaner. Now, Bikaner was a princely state in the Rajasthan region of India. And after the partition, Azra couldn't really carry much. So she just took with her this pearl string and a couple of pearl earrings, which had been gifted to her. And to this day, when she had been interviewed by Achal Malhotra, she kept these strings with the house, with her at the house, not in the bank locker, because she felt that she could relive those bygone days, even by having a look at these strings, these pearls. And these were not ordinary pearls, as we, I suppose, can imagine. They were gifts from a Maharaja, so they were actually made of rare Basra pearls. And coming to the adjacent image, this is actually a Mang Tika. Mang Tika can be roughly translated as a forehead ornament in English. And the red stones seen are actually rubies. There are also blue stones. The metal is gold. There are garnets and even diamonds. So we do know that this particular Mang Tika was an expensive piece of jewelry. It belonged to the Malhotra family, and they were fortunate enough to be able to carry it along with them when they came from West Pakistan to India. And it's still a family heirloom for them, though at present the Mang Tika, because it's so heavy, it has been converted into a necklace to be worn by the women folk of the family. So as we can see, these articles, I mean, they can be as mundane as a pair of scissors to as expensive as a jewel encrusted Mang Tika. They all have now transcended their monetary value and have become almost like artifacts, pieces which are treasured in museums and treasure troves for these people, because they bring alive for them the memories of their past lives when they were still happy and lived in an atmosphere of syncretism. Now, this brings to the end of the first section. I would now like to move on to the second section of my presentation, which deals with partition literature. And here I will focus on one particular short story titled Come, Sister Fatima. It was originally written in the Punjabi language by Baldev Singh, and subsequently it was translated into English by Geena Nandrajo and included in the anthology Stories About the Partition of India, Volume 4, edited by Alok Bhalla, once again a very renowned Indian scholar, and published in the year 2012. So what do we have? The story is basically about the narrator's mother, Babel. Now here I would like to clarify, Babel is not the proper, it's not a proper noun, but it's a generic name. It's not the first name of the mother, but it's actually a term of endearment for the mother in the Punjabi language. So the narrator's mother, Baby, she had a Muslim friend named Fatima, whose family decides to migrate to West Pakistan after the partition. Now, before her departure, Fatima visits Baby's house and shares her agony at being separated from her village. And while leaving, she also leaves a spinning wheel with Baby for safekeeping. Now, the question arises, why a spinning wheel? Because the spinning wheel was something very dear to Fatima. In fact, in the story, it's mentioned that Fatima had once said that the spinning wheel was dear even compared to her own sons. While that may be some sort of an exaggeration, we can still feel how Baby was deeply attached to it, because it brought back memories of the times that she spent with her childhood friend Fatima. Now, 50 years after the partition, Baby's son, that is the narrator, and Baby's grandchildren, they consider this spinning wheel as defunct, nothing more than a piece of junk. And so they decide to sell it off to a peddler along with other old and unused household goods. Now, the very sight of the spinning wheel in the heap of litter, it shocks Baby and brings her to tears. She reminisces about the time when Fatima had come while taking her leave, and she feels that as long as she is alive, the spinning wheel should remain in her home, even though it was no longer in use. In fact, the narrator says for the last 20-25 years, Baby had not used that spinning wheel even for once. And yet, Baby still clings on to that spinning wheel as almost a live embodiment of her friend Fatima. In fact, the conclusion of the story is rather interesting and even surprising, I would say. Baby actually takes it as a challenge to make the spinning wheel function again. And she goes to the extent of hiring a workhand to give the spinning wheel a fresh coat of painting. Then she straightens the spindle and oils the joints, and she brings up some cotton which had been stored in the family home and starts spinning that cotton into thread. It's almost as if it was her counter, her rejoinder to her daughters-in-law who used to make fun of her deep attachment to this particular spinning wheel. And the ending shows Baby going on spinning and crying. And it does leave the reader with a sense of poignancy of how these simple household objects can evoke the memories of a time past where circumstances were much more favorable compared to the present. So this is one story which I found uh, quite unconventional, mainly because unlike the previous category where the objects actually belong to the migrants and the refugees, here was one instance when the object had belonged to the migrant, but it was left in the safe custody of a family who were fortunate enough to find themselves on the right side of the border and had remained in their homes. And yet, a person like Baby, who herself didn't have to suffer the misery of partition, still feels the pangs of partition. The web of memory, past memory and nostalgia spreads around her, and she is equally moved by those memories, despite the fact that the spinning wheel didn't actually belong to her. It's how an inanimate object starts to have a life of its own, and how it can make an aged person once again feel young, so much so that she resumes spinning on this particular spinning wheel. Now I come to the third and final section of my presentation. Here I'll be speaking on material culture as evident in partition cinema, and I focus on one particular movie, Viceroy's House, which was directed by Gurinder Chadha, and it released in 2017. As you can see, 2017 seems to be quite an important year. I suppose it was the 70th anniversary of the Indian partition, which is why even Achal Malhotra's book was published the same year. Now, Viceroy's House, the screenplay was written by Chota herself, and her own ancestors, forefathers, had made this very painful trudge across the international border from Western Pakistan to India, in which one of her Chota's aunts actually breathes her last. So partition was a personal, a family tragedy for Chota as well, though she herself never got to see that aunt because, as I said, the aunt passed away during the course of the journey. So the subject was something very close to her heart, but what Chota does is, instead of showing the refugee columns or say the refugee camps, which are quite common in most of partition movies, she chooses to focus on a house, in this case, Viceroy's house in Delhi, where the last Viceroy of India, Lord Louis Mountbatten, his wife Edwina, and the two daughters were living for the few months in 1947 when the partition was actually executed. And the film shows these members of the colonial administration as well as Indian political leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, Muhammad Jinnah, and Sardar Tara Singh, forming some sort of a section which is mirrored by the support staff of this Viceroy's house. So the people who stay, who reside and work for the upkeeping, for the smooth functioning of the Viceroy's house, they tend to form each other's spoils, and we get to see that the political machinations going on in the great halls, the great corridors of this Viceroy house is actually mirrored by the petty quarrels, which is sometimes even lead to fisticuffs among the support staff belonging to different religions. In a way, the house becomes a microcosm for the larger violence that had gripped many parts of the subcontinent at that time. Incidentally, the Viceroy's house later on, after India became a sovereign country, was turned into the Rashtrapati Bhavan, that is the president's official residence, which it still is to this day. And the focus on a great house, a great mansion, in a way, allows Chadha to also show how this upstairs downstairs view has a certain resonance with what was happening in diverse corners of the country. Now, to conclude, I would like to once again go back to the title of my presentation, Material Memory and the Creation of Culture. So here, let me speak a few words on how the remembrance of these objects, buildings, have led to the creation of a cultural dimension, especially in the last couple of decades. Now, nowadays, apart from official history, we also lay emphasis on history from below, that is history pertaining to the common people. And this has been done through an emphasis on both oral narratives as well as literature and movies, cinema. Now, in the last few years or so, we have seen many initiatives being taken place in India, like the establishment of the Partition Museum in the Town Hall building of Amritsar, which is in the North Indian state of Punjab, which was partitioned in 47. The eastern part of Punjab became the Indian state of partition, Indian state of Punjab. And that particular museum houses a great number of mementos, curios, apart from official documents, which is now open to the public since 2017. Once again, 2017 seems to be a momentous year as far as Indian partition studies is concerned in this particular time. And since then, visitors have been to this Partition Museum from all parts of the country and sometimes even abroad. And they got to see objects, not like conventional museums, but objects which have a direct bearing on the Indian partition and which talk of the experiences that common people, not the who's who, not the political brass, the ordinary people, what they had to go through during those times. Now, coming to the eastern part of the subcontinent, as a matter of fact, Bengal too was partitioned. It's not only Punjab. I personally hail from the eastern part of the country, Bengal. And as far as this region is concerned, in the year 2018, a trust was built in Calcutta, and a proposal for the creation of a Kolkata Partition Museum was tabled. Now, while the actual building of the museum is still in the pipeline, recently, just a few days back, in this month itself, the trust announced its decision to come up with a virtual partition museum, which would, in all probability, be opened next year, that is August 2022, which would mark the 75th anniversary of the Indian partition. Now, till the time the actual physical partition museum, Kolkata Partition Museum, is built, we can look forward to this digital sphere, which will definitely go to some length in preserving these various documents, as well as, once again, mementos, memorabilia belonging to people who have suffered the miseries of partition in the eastern sector of the subcontinent. And it is hoped that this will enable a more faster dissemination of the knowledge which is accumulated through this process. And it also will facilitate the preservation of these valuables, at least in the digital sphere, for the posterity. So we are hopeful that this trend will continue in the coming years and will lead to new forms of creating culture. That's all for now.
Debasri, thank you very much. And such poignant stories definitely leaves an impact, doesn't it? I think at this point, I will invite Michael and Debasri to also talk about how you felt looking at each other's work. We are looking at two different parts of the world, but there are certain similarities that we see. There's that aspect. And for me, food, music, these become so prevalent in both of these sides of the world. I don't know how you feel about it and what you have to say. I'll
definitely, Pallavi. Yeah, as I've said, Michael's last section pertaining to that kebab knife, it really struck a chord, because food has been integral to cultures across the world, and it has been true for not just the Turkish person who is now settled in Canada, but even for partition refugees, as well as, I'm told, the Jewish people who have now settled in various parts of Europe as well as North America. As my presentation shows, ordinary utensils, the plate, the spoon, the pestle mortar, which is used for cooking, crushing the spices, all ingredients related to making food, that assumes a great importance. And just like the kebab knife pointed out by Michael, it does strengthen, it does in a way reinforce the past cultures even in a foreign setting. I would definitely like to hear what Michael has to say regarding this.
Yeah, no, I really, really enjoyed your presentation,
Thank
Devashree.
you.
I learned a lot, and I do have some other questions, but with regards to this, one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about some of the objects, the material memories, as you were discussing, which I think is a fantastic term, is the way in which an object can almost end up with like a semi-sacred kind of quality to it. It almost reminds me of relics in a kind of
Yes.
religious context, right? And how in those instances, I mean, they can be very fairly mundane things, but because they are attached to something that's almost is holy, it makes them more significant. Yeah, oh, sorry. Don't. Joys of work. Go, 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 go. My daughter is working from home today, so that was Audrey. And I've lost my train of thought. Yeah, but one of the things that I also think is really interesting is the way that these things, on the one hand, can almost have a kind of sacred value, but then also be very mundane and used in everyday life, right? So, and that was one of the points I was trying to make, is that it's in the enactment of use and that sort of thing that we have, that the character of space changes in some ways and affords a kind of connection to a heritage or to a past or whatever, and heritage in my mind is sort of a reaction or a constant rethinking of the past in the present, right? And so I could see how that was playing through with your examples as well. Although I think in some instances, the objects were almost held apart from. But I don't know from your work. Do you see how they're being used today, or is it more sort of they were used initially and now they're sort of set aside?
Most of them are now almost regarded as what you have termed relics. They do have, as you said, a sacred, a haloed status now, and they are kept in showcases and they are shown to guests only on special occasions. But the last item of Ajahn Malhotra's book, which I showed, the Mount Tika, as I said, originally it was a forehead ornament, but because it was too heavy, it had been refashioned into a necklace, which is still worn. And that I found was quite striking. While some may object to its change as tampering with something, a family heirloom, while I personally consider it as making something of the past a part and parcel of the present, so that it doesn't remain always tucked away in a bank locker, but is worn by the women folk on special occasions when Mantikas, usually during weddings and such other ceremonies and functions. So we can see both these modes of how people not just memorialize but also make these objects very much useful in their current lives.
Can I have a follow-up question, Pallavi?
Of course, Michael, of course.
So, because one of the things that crossed my mind, because I think one of the things you're suggesting, Devashree, is that these objects have a really strong personal connection, but they also have a political dimension to them. Because this is a political history as much as it's an ethnic history and a cultural history, and that sort of thing, and an economic history even. And I'm wondering about the politics around the creation of these partition museums in the last 5 years or so. I mean, who is leading the charge on these things, and how are they being received? Because again, these objects can be put on stage to do things, right? They have the power to shift, I think, perspectives or play a part in political discourse. So I had no idea about this stuff. I find it very fascinating. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
The Partition Museum in Amritsar, that has been founded with the help of government authorities. As I said, it is stationed in the town hall. So government approval was a must. As far as the proposed Kolkata Partition Museum is concerned, this is a strictly non-governmental trust, and it is being spearheaded by uh, Professor Rituparna Rai. She is once again a well-known partition scholar. She has lived in Europe, and she has, uh, I think, for almost 10 years, she was in Netherlands, and she got to see those Holocaust memorials, and that actually inspired her to have something like here for Kolkata as well, because the partition on the eastern side has been neglected in most instances. People usually focus only on the partition on the western side, that is Punjab, mainly because the violence was much more severe over there compared to the eastern side. But as I've said, the actual building is still, it's a, the planning level is going on. It's not very easy to acquire a piece of land and then construct the building. So for now, they have thought of creating a digital museum. And regarding this actually brings me to another initiative, which I suppose, Michael, you might be aware of because this happened in California. You might have heard of the Partition Archive, which was actually spearheaded by Gunita Bhalla. Once again, she's a descendant of a refugee family. She's a Punjabi, but now she's based in California. And she took it upon her to interview scores of people. She now has a team, and uh, they go and hold video sessions of these mainly aged people now in their 70s, 80s, some even in their 90s, because time is running out fast. And this is now taking place throughout the world, not just in North America, but also in India. And on a smaller scale, a university in my state of West Bengal, it's a Netaji Subhash Open University. It has collaborated with Khulna University in neighboring Bangladesh to create a similar oral repository. Uh, Such video recordings of these uh, refugees, their families, and their dissidents are available on the web, as well as print publication. The first volume of the proposed 4-volume publication was released recently, and the subsequent three volumes will be released hopefully within the next year or two. So both the government institutions as well as private individuals, cluster of private individuals, as well as universities, that is educational institutions, they are all in the fray at present, mostly with a certain academic purpose. But as you have said, some of it could have political motives, which of course, as of now, is still quite latent. It isn't out there. It isn't, out there in the open as of now. It's still quite academic as of today.
Michael, I think it'll be also nice if you could comment on your own question from your perspective in the sense of the sanctity of these memories versus the political agendas that may accompany.
Yeah, no, and it's I think in terms of the stuff that I've been involved in, I mean it's really largely an academic exercise, I would say. I mean, the connection with the with Ingenium, and I think has a broader social and arguably political dimension to it, because one of the things that one of the motivations for the designing domestic dining project was to better represent underrepresented communities in Canada in national museums. And so there is a socio-political dimension to that, and a way of creating dialogue with other communities and making them, allowing them to see themselves represented in the space of the museum, because the dominant narratives have been, Francophone and Anglophone communities in Canada. And also by being able to see themselves represented in the museum and its collections and that sort of thing, also find it a safe place to join and be part of. And so I think, so there is a bit of a political, I guess, a kind of, but I think it's maybe more at the sociocultural level than anything else. I mean, obviously, the example of the radio that we had gifted to us at Carleton certainly has a fraught political kind of history, but which I talked a little bit about. I'm no expert. I should have made a disclaimer. I'm no Holocaust expert. I know there's a great studies and like great Holocaust studies, and so this was sort of an entry for me into that. But I think its presence in a kind of university teaching collection allows for further exploration and inquiry and that sort of thing. And these conversations, these difficult conversations and difficult histories need to be constantly looked at and discussed and that sort of thing. And so, again, one of the things that I think both Devasri and I are keen to see is objects being used to further these kinds of discourse and ask and engage with maybe more difficult histories, and see them in some ways as participants in those histories, right?
Yes, and here, Michael, I would like to point out another advantage that these materials hold over documents. Reading documents is laborious and a time-consuming process. But even a short summary of what that object symbolizes, how it memorializes a certain history of a particular family, that has a much more human appeal to ordinary visitors. I'm just talking of people, say, who come to go visit the Partition Museum, just like they go to see other arts and artifacts in a normal museum. For them, these objects hold a kind of attraction which may not be available to other kinds of other modes through which partition knowledge regarding the partition is disseminated, say books or treatises or theses, which is for the most part for a non-academic audience can prove to be quite tedious.
It's a great point, and it actually reminds me. I always try to do material culture workshops and research in my methods classes. I teach in the history and theory of architecture program at Carleton, and even though it's that class isn't necessarily about architecture, it's about material culture. One of the things that we always come away with is the fact that material objects are documents in a way. I think one of the points that you're making is that they in some ways are almost more democratic because we don't have to be able to read them in the same way that you read a text. They kind of connect with on the human level. They have an affective quality as well as sort of an effective quality in a way, right? So so I think, that's one of the things that's so wonderful about it. On the other hand, they can be notoriously difficult to read sometimes, and they don't give you all the information. They give you some of the information, and they can be a starting point, and then you have to keep kind of returning to them. But as a result, because of that sort of human touch and the human quality, we're almost more inclined to come back to them maybe than we would some, not that I love archives, but the dusty old archive kind of thing. Sometimes that's less appealing, especially for for students.
Exactly. For laymen, I think these objects have a better prospect of, drawing their attention, attracting their attention, and most importantly, retaining their attention.
And I think that's something close to one of our audience questions, which Amit Shankar Saha is asking. He says, from carrying the names of places to carrying the soil of the places from where one is migrating, form a spectrum from the abstract to the concrete mnemonic devices of memory. All other objects come somewhere between that range and occupy memory pockets that can be accessed through the phatic to the haptic. Do you think objects have that quality of touch that abstract concepts like names don't have, and provide a dimension of closeness? I think we were talking on similar lines.
exactly. Do I go first?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Amit. I personally know him. He's a very distinguished poet, apart from being a scholar. And he's from my own alma mater, University of Calcutta. As he has pointed out, and carrying the names to the soil. I mean, these can be equated to the two ends of a spectrum. As a matter of fact, this has actually happened in the case of a partition where refugees and migrants, after they have settled, have actually renamed their, say, cooperatives or housing societies as their names of their erstwhile homes. This has happened with my own maternal family. And as far as carrying the soil is concerned, uh, I think a movie titled Mati, it's a Bengali movie. It was released in the year 2018, which once again deals with how Mati in Bengali is soil, how the soil can have its connection despite all odds. And I mean, no matter, I mean, across territories, across geographical territories, the pull of the soil still is very much prominent even after all these ages. I mean, as Amit has pointed out, because of the fact that we can touch the objects that we have brought along with us. That definitely proves to be an advantage over here compared to what Michael has said, uh, reading official documents or other forms of disciplinary history. Uh, they do form uh, an experience which is tangible enough for people, even those who have themselves not gone through such experiences, to at least relate to what has happened. And through a partition, I'm sure it is true of any other momentous event in world history which happened during a time of great turmoil. It's true of what happened in the Second World War in Europe, and not just Indians, but communities across the world who had to go through such forcible migration do still cling on to these objects as much and as closely as they cling on to their memories, because memories can fade, but especially with age. And nowadays we have dementia and Alzheimer's, but the objects, the very touch of those objects can provide, even if it's very feeble, a faint memory of what was at one point so very dear to those people. So yes, definitely. Uh, that's how material culture does have an edge over other forms of remembering.
I thank you, Amit, for the question. I to add, I guess, I think one of the things that material objects do is they confront us differently, because than say a text, and I think they spark in us, not, maybe it's initially a sense of touch or the haptic, but then it almost opens up the multisensorial spectrum for us, and we might start smelling and thinking and and listening and that sort of thing, and as a result they can be very very evocative, but because of that, because they open up the spectrum, they may allow for different kinds of questions to be asked, and I think that's very important. I think that names are incredibly powerful, though, and not only as visual markers, but also as sort of oral markers as well. And so you can kind of maybe come back to names from the object and see a kind of conversation happening between the two. And we all know that naming is about power, right? In the Western, Christian tradition, the fact that Adam gets to go around naming everything is a sign of power and control over the environment, right? And it almost, and sets up a kind of worldview in a very particular kind of way. but I think your question kind of gets to the heart of the possibilities that are brought on by engaging with material culture, because I think it opens a whole series of different kinds of questions, and I think it also reminds us that dealing with material culture and objects, sometimes very personal kind of objects, allow for opportunities for broader engagement and different kinds of engagement. And we've talked a little bit about kind of the academic kind of element to the creation of these partition museums or the studies that I was discussing. But a key element in that for the Designing Domestic Dining project was kind of the co-creation of research. By engaging with the community, we had described this as an engagement with the Turkish community in Ottawa, and then through engagement with the participants, we realized that there were some challenges around, and again, to go to your point about names, there's a politics to that name, and so we took a more inclusive title of Anatolian communities, which speaks more to a geographical and more maybe even more ethnic and culturally diverse group of communities, because like everywhere else on the planet, that region of the country is very cosmopolitan and diverse, right? So and even in our engagements with the participants, in some ways they got to lead the interview, because we were talking to them in their home as they were making the thing that they chose to do, and created a kind of dialogue. So I think there are opportunities when we're doing this kind of research to maybe rethink potential power imbalances between, say, official culture through academia, government, etc., and participants or communities. So again, I really like your question, because I think it's getting at one thing that I'm thinking of more and more, and that is how the multisensorial can kind of reshift and have us re-examine the kinds of questions that we asked in the first place.
That's great. Also, there is a question from our YouTube viewer, Vibhuti, and she is asking what's the cultural dimension of inheritance? So, and if it's a very crisp question there, and I probably hopefully not interpreting it wrong when I say, how does that cultural dimension seep through into the second, third generation of diasporic communities, and what cultural associations do they have then? Does it still become as meaningful for them? And your thoughts on that?
I guess I can give it a go first, because Diaspora had to go first last time. It's a really good question. I think the cultural dimensions of inheritance are going to, by necessity, change, because the people are changing and time is passing. And I think the notion of heritage isn't the past, it's the working out of the past through traditions in the present, I think. And so it will change alongside our current culture, and will be worked through and lived and enacted differently over time. Much as we write history differently. We don't like to think about that, but that's also true. I mean, history is always written in the present about the past. And so when you're looking at your history, you're looking at someone's perspective at a certain point of time about how they interpreted the past, or the elements of the past that they had access to. And so so it's a good question. I mean, what will, for example, these objects, the sort of relics and legacy of partition, for example, how will they make meaning in 50 years? Will it look the same as right now? I can't imagine they will, but I think there'll be certain components of it that will, much as the kinds of things that I was talking about, I think. But I'll turn it to Diaspora.
Well, I do agree with Michael, as he said. I mean, there can't be one single answer to this after all. While some of the artifacts will still retain their value in terms of memory, it's quite possible that until and unless there is any actual effort to preserve them, they may, there is a possibility that they may, become subject to the ravages of time. As in the story Come Sister Fatima, where we have the spinning wheel. In the story, it's mentioned that now it's partially almost eaten by termites, and the spindle is broken, and the joints are low, and hinges are all loose. So there's always the danger of certain objects uh, degenerating, crumbling until and unless proper care and maintenance is taken. And the other aspect is, of course, how much value will the subsequent generations assign to these objects? While some which are actually of monetary value, like we talked about the Mangtika or the Pashmina shawl, which is actually very expensive, or for that matter, even the pearl necklace made of rare basra pearls. While these can be considered as heirlooms and may be transmitted through generations, other mundane banal objects like a pair of scissors or that brass plate, which is, even the coating in most parts has now come off. It is actually a question uh, which is very pertinent. How much will the descendants uh, think of these items uh, as valuable? Whether they would still retain their memorial value, or it's also possible that they might be regarded as junk, and after a generation or two, they might be disposed of, sold off to the peddler, as it almost happens in that story. So yes, this question once again is open to speculation, and for the present we can only speculate, and as well as if possible, try and take initiatives to at least retain as much as possible. That's the best that can be done at present.
Thank you, Michael and Devasri. And I would now ask the team to proceed with the question and answers that they have. And I know we've been on this webinar for a little bit longer than we anticipated. And so if you would like to be brief or curt, that's fine. Do you want to start, Brittany?
Yeah, first of all, thank you both for joining us, and I really enjoyed your presentations. They were really interesting. My question is for Michael. So you mentioned that many early radio broadcasting stations were designed with maps on the walls or on the floors that highlighted other broadcasting stations across Canada to visually represent a certain connectivity that was perpetuated by radio. Do you think the design of radio stations in present time is still as impactful or meaningful as it once was in terms of transmitting a sense of cultural unity throughout a nation?
Thanks, Brittany, for your question. And again, apologies to everybody for going on so long with my initial presentation. Yeah, anyways, I'm cutting our Q&A a bit short. In short, I would say that they're not new, they're not shiny and new, and it's not a new technology in the same way that it was in the 1930s, let's say, for example. And so I don't think the design of radio stations and television stations and that sort of thing has the same sort of appeal that it did then. Part of what was happening too, I mean, they became like tourist attractions. People would travel to a transmission station, right? Which, for us, I mean, why would you do that? But to go out there and see the technology in use, right? And that's really kind of interesting. And again, I think as part of the mandate of the CBC and at the time, I mean, they were trying to try to visually and materially show how they're pulling the country together, because it was a fairly abstract idea, I think, in the 30s. It also costs more and those kinds of things, and so I don't think you would see that same kind of attention. I think the there's probably more of a shift toward, the user experience and comfortability in studios than trying to represent, nation through the architecture or through the design decisions. So, thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
I have another question for Michael. So I'm wondering, besides one form of media being an audio experience and the other visual, do you think radio and film media affect their respective audiences differently in the ways that they form a connection or a cultural identity?
Absolutely. Like good old Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message and all that. They do affect us differently. And I'm sure we've all had experiences, with media and how they operate, right? Probably a lot of you listen to podcasts, right? And in some ways that's a new variation on radio in a way, and it's sort of giving it a new kind of life. I think that radio or audio material has a kind of closeness or an intimacy to it that in some ways television and film maybe don't. Because it's almost literally like in your head, right? And by focusing on one sense, you can, on the one hand, it can be a secondary medium. While you're washing the dishes, you could be listening to something, right? But on the other hand, you can, if you're having kind of concentrated listening, you have a kind of closeness to the person speaking or to the music or whatever that you may not get otherwise. So I think I think it's one of the things that our conversation is bringing out here is the importance of considering our sensorial experience with any media, whether it's an object, whether it's a media text, like visual culture or audio culture and that sort of thing. So I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but I think there are differentiations, and I think that one of the things that we can do is think about how we are, phenomenologically experience them, and then what kind of impact that might have.
Thank you.
So the next question we have is for Debistry. So do you think televisual representations of culturally significant events that are embellished for entertainment value are dangerous because viewers from other cultures may accept the depictions as facts?
Anastasia, thanks for a very relevant question. In fact, I come from India, which has the largest movie industry. I suppose most of you are aware of the term Bollywood. It actually refers to the Hindi film industry, though movies are made in other languages of India as well. But yes, the kind of image, excuse me, that is broadcast through these mainstream popular movies can have, excuse me, a very powerful impact, especially on non-culture audiences, viewers. And as far as movies pertaining to the partition is concerned, or for that matter, any event which has a historical resonance, it is very important to have, if not an actual factual account, then certainly be careful not to exaggerate it or show it in a particular slanted perspective. Unfortunately, as far as partition movies are concerned, there have been a few instances where nationalism, overt nationalism, and some rare extreme cases, even jingoism, that has held sway in the storyline and say in the dialogues of the hero, or for that matter, even the heroine. So that the essence of the pain and the suffering is sort of trumped by the heroics of the lead character. Usually it's the male protagonist. This actually happened with a film titled Gadar, which was released in the year 2001. The director was Anil Sharma, and it had a very high-strung take on an actual event which had taken place during the partition. So while it was based on a fact, the way the director chose to portray it on the celluloid created a lot of controversy, uh, especially across the border in Pakistan, the way some of the Pakistani characters were portrayed. And that led to some amount of discomfort for not just historians and scholars, but also lovers of cinema, because they felt that a topic as sensitive as the partition or something which is so significant, which has a bearing for people across the subcontinent. They felt it deserved a more mature handling of the subject. So yes, at times it can happen.
So the last question that we have for you, Debasri, is with multiple televisual and written novels on the events of the partition, do you believe that more mediums and perspectives provide a more accurate depiction of the events, or do you believe that the message can sometimes get lost with the more perspectives?
Well, actually, I would like to once again refer to my earlier response while answering your question. As a matter of fact, this subject of the partition has been portrayed time and again, both on the big screen, that is the celluloid, as well as the small screen, both in India as well as Pakistan and later on Bangladesh. Uh, I would like to come up with a couple of examples to show how, while diverse media, be it the big screen, the small screen, can sometimes be helpful in providing, especially small screen, because television has a much wider base and viewership in the subcontinent compared to movies, because not everyone can afford expensive movie tickets, but they can afford the television subscription and can watch a TV series at home. While it does go out to make people aware of these historical events, there's always the danger, as I had mentioned it in the case of Gadar. Small screen also has had its fair share of controversy as far as programs related to the partition are concerned. There was a tele-series named Tamas, which was directed by an eminent director, but because the director and the screenplay writer had chosen to partially modify what was there in the original Hindi novel written by Visham Sahani. So the novel and the teleseries did not really match. So the tweaking of the novel, resulting in the final telescript, that did ruffle some feathers as far as India was concerned. There were also some violent demonstrations in some cities. This happened in the 1980s, late 1980s. And as far as this present century is concerned, the 21st century, in fact, in the year 2015, a Pakistani serial, it was broadcast in Indian TV. It was rechristened, and once again, the serial was based on an Urdu novel. It had amassed huge popularity in Pakistan, which was by Z Cinema and Z Movies and Z Television, the conglomerate that purchased the copyrights and started broadcasting it on Indian television, hoping that it will once again be successful in reaching out to the viewers. That actually had a counter effect. And once again, there were a lot of complaints, though this time there were no such violent episodes or demonstrations. The complaints were mainly channeled through the official, there's a body which caters to such problems, and it even went to the courts. And by the time the court gave its verdict, the broadcasting had already ended, but the court did say that this particular serial would not be repeated again on Indian small screen. Once again, here, just like earlier, certain political, you know, uh, dealings might have played a role, it's possible. And yet, because the screenwriters make some changes in the screenplay, which is different from what was in the original novel, that too has a bearing on the final reception. You must also remember here that as far as the partition is concerned, the reception that one might have in Pakistan can be very much different from what one might have in India, despite it being the same subject, because the way things are portrayed and the perspective of the director and the scriptwriter can differ. So while it's a bit tricky subject, which is why particular movie can be commercially a hit in a certain region and a commercial flop in across the border, because once again the way people look at it differs. Once again, it basically boils down to their religious identities, their affiliations. So it can create controversies. Sometimes they are also whipped up for petty, narrow political gains. But as you have said, broadly speaking, if we venture out of the Indian subcontinent, then definitely such programs, be it in television or in cinema, definitely have the, I would say, potential to cater to audiences. Remember, I'm not speaking of a strictly subcontinental audience, but let's say in Europe nowadays, Indian movies are popular across the globe. So uh, over there, especially in terms of non-cultural viewership, these works definitely have a very high possibility and high potential of not just disseminating these historical events, but also perhaps touching a chord with their lives, because after all, it's all about loss, pain, which, as we all know, is very much universal.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Debasri and Michael. I think it's been a very good discussion and brings out so many things that, although we've been reading your work, I think this discussion really helps clarify a lot of other things for us. So thank you very much for your time and the wonderful presentations. Also, thank you to the organizing team and the audience here. We will be meeting again this Saturday for our last webinar of this series. There will be more series coming later, but for this series, we are meeting again on Saturday. So hopefully everyone can join again at that time. But any last words, Michael and Debasri, if you want to, before we stop for today?
Well, once again, I would like to, extend a very special thanks to Pallavi, as well as everyone from her student organizing team for providing me with this opportunity to share my research work with others. I hope I have been able to at least speak something of a subject which is very close to my heart and on which I've been working for the last 15 years or so. And definitely it has also given me the opportunity to know about Michael's work. That section on the radio was really interesting. I must acknowledge that. And of course, the ways in which radio, for that matter, even the piano, various modes of recreation, that also can say, speak in volumes about how people, despite leaving their original homes, still manage to carry along with them, parts of their erstwhile lives. That is something which definitely gives us hope, especially in a very highly volatile and fluid situation where everything seems to be in a flux. So yes, it has been a very enriching session for me personally.
And I guess I would just echo all of that. I couldn't have put it better. And I really so thank you to all this to all of you for organizing this, and Diaspora for your presentation and your fascinating research. I think I need to go out and watch the Viceroy's house now and see how that plays out. Just all of it. And I hope that this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation, because I found it very very stimulating. And thanks to all the participants and I guess audience members for tuning in as well. So I guess more to come. But thank you so much.
Yes,
Yes, I definitely look forward to more of such events. The discussion should go on.
Hopefully it will, Devasri and Michael. So thank you again, and we'll tune off now. Thank you again to the team.
Okay.
Bye.
Hope all of you have a nice day.